The sun was a hammer beating the red sand into a shimmering haze. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated Elsie's tongue and settled in a gritty film on her skin. Every jolt of the stagecoach sent a fresh wave of pain up her right leg, a deep, familiar ache that had been her constant companion for over a decade. The heat was a physical presence, pressing in from all sides, suffocating the air inside the coach until each breath was a conscious effort. Outside, the landscape was vast and indifferent, a sprawling canvas of cracked earth, skeletal yucca, and distant mesas that wavered like ghosts in the heat. She was traveling to Redemption Creek to claim the small parcel of land her late father had left her. A final desperate gamble on a life that had offered her little else. The journey had been a relentless ordeal, but it was almost over. The driver had called out an hour prior that they were nearing the town, and a fragile tendril of hope had begun to unwind in Elsie's chest. It was then that the world exploded into chaos. A rifle shot cracked through the drowsy afternoon, the sound sharp and violent. The coach lurched, horses screaming in terror as they were reined in with brutal force. Elsie was thrown against the opposite seat, the impact jarring the weak bone in her leg. Before she could recover, the door was wrenched open, and the leering face of a man, his features obscured by a dusty bandana, filled the opening. "Everybody out, nice and slow," he barked, his voice a gravelly rasp. The other passengers, a portly salesman and a severe-looking woman in a black bonnet, scrambled out with their hands raised, their faces pale with fear. Elsie followed her movements, stiff and awkward. The moment her foot touched the ground, her leg buckled, and she stumbled, catching herself against the coach wheel. The bandit's eyes, cold and dark above the cloth, flickered to her leg for a moment, a glint of something unreadable passing through them. 3 other men, all masked, were holding the driver and his guard at gunpoint. But it was the 4th man who emerged from behind a cluster of sun-scorched boulders who drew every eye. He moved with a chilling confidence, his duster hanging open to reveal a pair of holstered pistols. His mask was a plain black cloth, but it could not hide the authority in his posture or the piercing intensity of his gaze. He was clearly the leader. He ignored the mailbags, ignored the trembling salesman fumbling with his wallet. His steps were deliberate, measured, as he walked directly toward Elsie. The air grew thick with a sudden personal tension. The other passengers faded into the background, becoming mere witnesses to a drama they did not understand. The locket, the leader said, his voice low and controlled, yet carrying an unmistakable command. Elsie's hand flew to her neck, her fingers closing instinctively around the small, cool oval of silver that rested against her collarbone. It was her mother's, the only thing she had left of her. The intricate floral engraving was worn smooth from years of her own touch. Inside, a tiny painted miniature of her mother's face smiled out a ghost of a memory. I don't understand," she stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It has no value. It's only silver." "Give it to me," he repeated, his voice dropping, taking on an edge of raw impatience. He took another step, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the dust and sweat on him, feel the menace radiating from his frame. Tears of fear and outrage pricked her eyes. "No," she whispered the word, a fragile breath of defiance. "Please." He did not ask again. His hand shot out, fingers closing around the delicate chain. With a single brutal jerk, he ripped it from her neck. The chain snapped, scratching her skin. The locket fell into his gloved palm. He didn't even glance at it. He simply closed his fist around it and turned away. "We're done here," he called to his men. The bandits mounted their horses, their movements swift and practiced. In moments, they were gone, swallowed by the shimmering heat and leaving behind a cloud of choking red dust. The salesman collapsed against the coach, sobbing with relief. The woman in the bonnet was praying aloud. But Elsie stood frozen, her hand pressed to the raw, empty place on her neck. The pain in her leg was a dull throb compared to the sharp, hollow ache in her chest. The robbery had not been random. It had been an execution of purpose. They hadn't wanted money or mail. They had wanted her locket, her mother, her last connection to a life before the fall, before the shame. The shock gave way to a cold, hard certainty. This was not just a robbery. It was a message. And as the stagecoach finally rattled toward the dusty outline of Redemption Creek, two questions burned in Elsie's mind, searing away her fear and leaving a core of hardened resolve. Who was that man, and why did he only want her locket? She had come to this forsaken land seeking a new beginning. But she knew now she had found something else entirely. She had found a fight. Redemption Creek announced itself not with a welcoming sign, but with a lingering silence. The town was a single dusty street, flanked by sun-bleached wooden buildings that sagged as if weary of the heat. The sun was a hammer here too, beating down on the parched earth, and the only sound was the low hum of flies around the saloon doors and the creak of a wind-whipped sign for the general store. As Elsie limped down the main street, her carved staff a new and awkward extension of her arm, and the silence was broken by the quiet turning of heads. Windows became frames for curious, judgmental faces. Men paused their conversations, their eyes lingering on her uneven gait. Women gathered their skirts, whispering behind their hands. She had felt judged before, but this was different. This was the collective, suspicious gaze of a community bound by shared hardship, a town that did not welcome outsiders, especially one who carried her brokenness so plainly for all to see. The dust wasn't just on the ground. It was in the air, in the eyes of the people, a fine grit of mistrust that coated everything. Her father's letter had spoken of a small parcel of land, with a working spring, a place of hope. Looking at the cracked facades and the wary faces of Redemption Creek, hope felt like a dangerous lie. The sheriff's office was a small, cramped building with a barred window and a smell of stale coffee. Sheriff Anson Boone was a man whose weariness seemed etched into his bones. His face was a roadmap of past troubles, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his badge. He listened to Elsie's account of the robbery with a dispassionate air, his pen scratching methodically across a report. "A locket, you say, silver?" he asked, not looking up. "Yes, it was my mother's. They didn't take anything else of value." Sheriff Boone finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were tired, but for a moment they held a flicker of something that might have been pity. "Ma'am, road agents out here are a fact of life. They take what glitters. Maybe they thought it was worth more than it was. He came right for me." Elsie insisted, her voice tight. He knew what he wanted. It was personal. The sheriff sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of resignation. "Everything feels personal when a gun's in your face. I'll ask around, put the word out. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. Things that are lost in the desert tend to stay lost." He pushed the finished report aside, a clear dismissal. Frustration and a chilling sense of isolation settled over Elsie. The law in this town was as tired and worn out as the buildings. She was on her own. Her next stop was the land office to file the deed her father had left her. The office was surprisingly grand compared to the rest of the town, built of dark, sturdy timber, with large glass windows that were impeccably clean. Behind a polished oak desk sat a man who seemed as out of place as his office. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands clean and uncalloused. He rose as she entered, a smile on his face that was both charming and predatory. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth as poured whiskey. "I am Silas Blackwood. Welcome to Redemption Creek. How may I be of service?" "I'm here to file a deed," Elsie said, placing the worn document on his desk. "For the land left to me by my father, Thomas Miller." Blackwood's smile did not falter, but a subtle change occurred in his eyes, a sharpening, a sudden focus that made the hairs on Elsie's arms stand up. He picked up the deed, his fingers tracing the edges as if weighing its importance. "Thomas Miller's daughter," he murmured, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "Of course. A tragedy, his passing. He was a man of considerable ambition." He let the words hang in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. "This parcel," he continued, tapping the map appended to the deed, "is a fine piece of property. It contains the only reliable spring for miles. In a town dying of thirst, water is more valuable than gold." He leaned forward, his polite demeanor a thin veneer over a core of steel. "Your father and I had a standing agreement. Should he ever decide to part with the land, I would be the first to have the option to purchase it. As his heir, I extend that generous offer to you. I will pay you a fair price, more than fair, and you can be on the next stagecoach out of this dusty hellhole back to civilization." His words were an offer, but they felt like a threat. The casual mention of her leaving, the dismissal of her new home as a hellhole, it was all designed to make her feel small, out of place, and eager to run. "The land is not for sale," Elsie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My father left it to me. I intend to live here." Blackwood's smile tightened at the edges. A woman alone with a handicap. He gestured vaguely toward her leg, the word handicap landing like a slap. "This is a harsh country, Miss Miller. It has a way of breaking even the strongest of men. It would be a shame to see you broken by it as well." A cold dread washed over Elsie. She remembered the bandit's eyes, the purpose in his actions. Now, looking into Silas Blackwood's cool, calculating gaze, she felt the same chilling sense of premeditation. He wanted her land, and she was beginning to suspect he was a man who got what he wanted one way or another. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwood," she said, pulling the deed back across the desk. "But my mind is made up." She turned and walked out of the office, the weight of his stare following her every limping step. The inciting incident had passed. The lines had been drawn. Silas Blackwood wanted her land, the very heart of the town's survival, and she was the only thing standing in his way. As she stepped back out into the oppressive heat of Redemption Creek, she knew the stolen locket was just the beginning. The hostility of Redemption Creek was a quiet, suffocating blanket. It wasn't in shouted insults, but in the way the store owner, a mousy man named Abernathy, suddenly couldn't meet her eyes when she tried to open a line of credit. It was in the way mothers pulled their children away as she passed, as if her limp were a contagious disease. Her father had been an outsider, a man who kept to himself, and his legacy had left her with no allies. She was alone, a broken woman, trying to claim a piece of land the most powerful man in town considered his own. Her father's cabin was a few miles outside of town, a small sturdy structure overlooking a dry arroyo. It was simple, but the spring Blackwood had mentioned trickled nearby, a thin, miraculous ribbon of life in the parched landscape. This was her inheritance, a place of solitude and potential. But it was also isolated, vulnerable. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every howl of a distant coyote made her heart leap into her throat. The memory of the masked man's hand closing around her locket was a constant, terrifying presence. Days bled into a week. Her supplies dwindled. Her attempts to hire a man to help her clear a small patch for a garden were met with polite but firm refusals. No one wanted to be seen working for the woman who had defied Silas Blackwood. Desperation began to gnaw at her. She visited Sheriff Boone again, asking if there was any news. He just shook his head, his tired eyes offering no comfort. "Leave it be, Miss Miller," he advised, his tone low. "Some things are best left undisturbed." His words felt less like advice and more like a warning. It was during one of her trips to town, as she was leaving the general store with a meager bag of flour, that a group of Blackwood's ranch hands loitered outside. They tipped their hats with exaggerated courtesy, their grins cruel. "Looky here," one of them drawled. "It's the little crippled bird. Think you can build a nest all by yourself out there?" Their laughter followed her down the street, each snicker a stone thrown at her already bruised dignity. Shame burned in her cheeks. She quickened her pace, her limp more pronounced under the stress, and in her haste, her staff slipped on a loose rock. She stumbled, the bag of flour flying from her grasp and bursting on the ground, a white cloud of her precious supply settling in the red dust. The ranch hands roared with laughter. Elsie squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears of humiliation. She was about to turn and flee when a shadow fell over her. A man knelt, his large, weathered hands carefully gathering the ripped edges of the flour sack. He moved with a quiet economy, ignoring the taunts from the onlookers. He was tall, his frame lean and wiry, and he wore the dusty, worn clothes of someone who spent more time with the land than with people. His face was sharp, angular, and deeply tanned, with lines around his eyes that spoke of countless hours squinting into the sun. But it was his eyes themselves that held her. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they missed nothing. "Let them laugh," he said, his voice a low, rough baritone. "A fool's laughter is just the sound of an empty pot boiling." He managed to save a good portion of the flour, tying the sack closed with a piece of twine from his pocket. He handed it to her, his calloused fingers brushing hers. Then he rose, turning to face the ranch hands. He didn't say a word, just stood there, his gaze level and unwavering. Under that silent, assessing stare, the men's laughter faltered. They shifted uncomfortably, their bravado evaporating. After a moment, they mumbled curses and shuffled away. "Thank you," Elsie said, her voice barely a whisper. He simply nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the staff, the determined set of her jaw, the lingering shame in her eyes. "You're the one who took the Miller place." It wasn't a question. "I am, Elsie Miller." "Jedediah Stone," he replied. "Folks call me Jed." The name was vaguely familiar. She thought she'd heard it mentioned in hushed tones, often accompanied by a shake of the head. He was an outcast, she realized, just like her. "You shouldn't be out there alone," he said, his tone direct, devoid of pity. "Blackwood's got his eye on that spring." "I know," she said. "I think he sent men to rob me on the stagecoach. They took a locket, nothing else." Jed's piercing eyes narrowed. He looked down the street in the direction of Blackwood's office. Blackwood doesn't use road agents for something as small as a locket. But he's not a man who likes being told no. He paused, then looked back at her. "I'm a tracker. For a price, I can find out who was behind that robbery." A flicker of hope ignited within Elsie. Here was someone who wasn't afraid of Blackwood, someone who saw the truth of her situation. "I don't have much money." "I'm not talking about money," he said, his gaze dropping for a second to the flour-dusted staff in her hand. "Some things are worth more than gold, and are harder to get back. You need help. I need work. We can help each other." In that moment, standing in the dusty street amid the whispers and stares, Elsie made a choice. She could not fight this battle alone. Sheriff Boone was useless, and the rest of the town was hostile. Jed Stone was a pariah, a man who lived on the fringes, but in his quiet confidence and direct gaze, she saw a strength she desperately needed. "All right, Mr. Stone," she said, meeting his eyes. "You're hired." Jed Stone was a man of few words, but his silence was a living thing. It was the silence of the hawk circling on a thermal, of the patient hunter waiting for his prey. He moved through the arid landscape around Elsie's cabin, as if he were a part of it, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the subtle language of broken twigs, scuffed earth, and displaced stones. He suggested they start at the site of the stagecoach ambush. The ride out was tense. The sun beat down, and the memory of the attack hung heavy in the air. Elsie found herself watching Jed, and the way he sat his horse with an easy grace, the way his gaze never stopped moving. He didn't offer comforting platitudes. He offered competence, and for Elsie that was far more valuable. The site was just as she remembered it, a narrow pass between rust-colored rock formations. To her, it was a place of trauma. To Jed, it was a page to be read. He dismounted and began to walk the ground in a slow, deliberate spiral. He crouched, his fingers brushing the dirt, his focus absolute. 4 riders, he said after a long silence, his voice low. They waited up there. He pointed to a rocky outcrop overlooking the road. Waited a long time. They knew the coach's schedule. He continued his search, his movements methodical. Elsie stayed back, feeling useless, a mere spectator to his craft. The heat was oppressive, and the pain in her leg began to throb with a vengeance. She leaned against a boulder, closing her eyes, at the image of the masked leader's hand tearing the locket from her neck, flashing behind her lids. Found something. Jed's voice cut through her thoughts. He was kneeling near where the bandits' horses had stood. In his palm lay a small, dark object. He beckoned her over. It was a horseshoe, but it was unlike any she had ever seen. It was cleanly made, and on one side, a small, distinct brand was stamped into the metal, a stylized bee intertwined with a serpent. Blackwood. Elsie breathed, her heart beginning to pound. Maybe Jed said, his expression unreadable. He pocketed the horseshoe. A brand on a shoe is unusual. Expensive. Means the owner cares about his stock, or wants it known who they belong to. Could be a plant meant to throw us off, or it could be arrogance. They rode back to her cabin in a thick silence. The discovery of the horseshoe was a tangible link, a solid piece of evidence in a mystery that had felt formless and overwhelming. It changed everything. Blackwood wasn't just intimidating her. He had actively orchestrated a violent attack against her. The stakes were no longer just about land, they were about justice. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of deep purple and orange, they sat by the small fire outside her cabin. The desert air grew cool and the scent of sagebrush sharpened. "Why are you helping me?" Elsie asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. "The whole town is afraid of him." Jed stared into the flames, his chiseled features cast in flickering light and shadow. For a long time, she thought he wouldn't answer. "I know what it is to have something taken from you," he said finally, his voice rough with an old, buried pain. "Something that can't be replaced. And I know what it's like to be blamed for it." He looked up, and in his pale eyes, she saw profound weariness, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "A few years back, I was tracking for the army. A small band of renegades had taken a homesteader's boy. I led the soldiers to their camp. I told the captain to wait for dawn, to approach with caution. He was young, arrogant, eager for a medal." Jed's voice grew quieter, flatter. He didn't listen. Charged in at dusk. In the confusion, the boy was killed. They needed someone to blame. The captain said I led them into a trap. The town, they believed him. They always believe the man with the uniform over the man who speaks to the dust. Elsie's chest tightened with a pang of empathy. Ostracized, cast aside. She understood that language all too well. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a slight dismissive shake of his head. "Sorrow doesn't change the past. Action does. Blackwood thinks because he owns this town, He's above the law. He thinks because you're a woman and because you limp that you're weak. We're going to prove him wrong." His words, simple and direct, were a balm to her soul. He didn't see her as the little crippled bird. He saw her as a partner. Strength, not pity. For the first time since arriving in Redemption Creek, Elsie felt she was not entirely alone. A fragile alliance had been forged in the firelight. Two outcasts bound by a shared desire for a justice this town had long forgotten. The next day, she decided it was time for a more direct approach. Armed with the knowledge of the branded horseshoe and the steady presence of Jed waiting with the horses at the edge of town, Elsie walked back into the polished confines of the land office. Blackwood was there, as always, looking immaculate. He greeted her with the same predatory smile. "Miss Miller, have you reconsidered my generous offer?" "I'm not here to sell, Elsie," said her voice firm. She placed her hands on the edge of his desk, leaning forward slightly. "I'm here to talk about my welcome to Redemption Creek, the part that involved 4 masked men and a stolen locket." Blackwood's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold as ice. "I heard about that unfortunate incident. A terrible welcome indeed. The territory is rife with ruffians. One of the ruffians was riding a horse shod with a very distinctive brand." Elsie pressed on her heart, hammering. "A bee intertwined with a serpent." For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something surprise annoyance crossed Blackwood's face before it was smoothed away. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "My brand is well known, Miss Miller. I am the largest rancher in this territory. It would not be difficult for a thief to acquire one of my horses. Perhaps I should have my men do a full inventory. Thank you for bringing this to my attention." He was good. He twisted her accusation into a helpful piece of information, turning the tables with effortless grace. But Elsie wasn't finished. "The man who took my locket," she said, her voice dropping, "he wasn't interested in money. He wanted one specific thing. An old silver locket with a miniature portrait inside. A portrait of my mother, Eleanor Miller." At the mention of her mother's name, the mask finally slipped. A shadow passed over Blackwood's features, a complex, agonizing mix of emotions she couldn't decipher. It was there and gone in a second, but she had seen it. He had known her mother. "Your father was a fool, Thomas Miller," Blackwood said, his voice losing its polished edge and taking on a raw, bitter tone. "He and my father were partners once. They built this town from nothing. But your father's greed ruined everything. He cheated my family, took what was rightfully ours, and left us with nothing but dust and debt. This land, this spring, it was supposed to belong to a Blackwood. It is my birthright." The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. This wasn't about water rights or a business deal. This was a vendetta decades old, passed from father to son. "And my mother," Elsie asked, her throat tight. Blackwood stood, turning to look out the window at the dusty street. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer, laced with a pain that sounded shockingly genuine. "Eleanor was an unfortunate casualty of your father's ambition. He took her too." He turned back to face her, his composure restored, his eyes once again hard and cold. "The past has a way of collecting its debts, Miss Miller. Your father owed my family a great deal. Now so do you. I will have that land. I suggest you remember that." Elsie walked out of the office, her body trembling. The mystery had cracked open, revealing a dark, tangled history of betrayal and loss. Blackwood's hatred for her father was a living, breathing thing, and his connection to her mother, the locket, it made the violation of the robbery 100 times more personal. Jed was waiting for her, his expression questioning. "It's a vendetta," she told him, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It's about something that happened between our fathers. And he knew my mother. Jed's gaze hardened. That makes him more dangerous. A man seeking profit can be bought. A man seeking revenge will burn the world down to get it. He was right. Blackwood's campaign of polite threats and veiled offers was over. Now the real war would begin. Blackwood's retaliation was swift and suffocating. The whispers that had followed Elsie through town now became a wall of open hostility. When she went to the general store, Mr. Abernathy, his face pale and sweating, informed her that her line of credit had been rescinded. "I'm sorry, Miss Miller," he stammered, unable to meet her gaze. It's just business." But she saw the fear in his eyes. It wasn't business. It was an order from Silas Blackwood. Her isolation was now complete. She was an enemy of the town's benefactor, and no one dared cross him. Her supplies were critically low. The small amount of money she had would not last long. Jed helped where he could, bringing her game he'd hunted and showing her which desert plants were edible. But it was a temporary solution. Blackwood was strangling her slowly and deliberately, trying to starve her out. The psychological pressure was just as relentless. His ranch hands began to ride the perimeter of her property, their presence a constant silent threat. They never crossed onto her land, but they were always there, watching from a distance, their figures dark silhouettes against the horizon. The nights became longer, filled with a creeping dread. It was the memory of her accident that began to surface unbidden in the quiet, lonely hours. She had been 10 years old, a confident rider galloping across the fields near her family's old home. She remembered the sudden sharp sound like a whip crack, and her horse screaming, rearing violently. Then there was only pain and a terrifying fall into darkness. It had been ruled an accident. A snake perhaps had spooked the horse. But now, in the shadow of Blackwood's revealed vendetta, the word accident felt hollow, a convenient lie. She needed to know more. The town doctor, a nervous elderly man named Elias Webb, had been the one to set her leg all those years ago. He had moved to Redemption Creek a few years after her family had. Finding him felt like a long shot, but she had to try. She found him in his small, cluttered office, the air thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol and old paper. Dr. Webb was a man who seemed to be perpetually shrinking. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darting about as if expecting a blow. When Elsie told him who she was, a flicker of recognition and stark terror crossed his face. "I remember," he said, wringing his hands. "A terrible accident, a terrible break. I did the best I could." "Dr. Webb," Elsie said, keeping her voice calm and even, "I need you to tell me what you remember about that day. Was there anything unusual?" The doctor began to tremble. He shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding her eyes. "It was a long time ago, Miss Miller. Memories fade. It was a simple fall from a horse. My father never believed it was that simple." Elsie pressed, leaning forward. "He thought he heard something just before the horse bolted, like a gunshot but smaller, quieter." Dr. Webb froze. His face went ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, glancing nervously toward the window as if expecting to see Blackwood himself standing there. "Please," Elsie whispered, her own voice shaking now. "It's important." I can't," he stammered, sweat beading on his wrinkled brow. "He'll ruin me. You don't understand the power that man has. He owns this town, this county. He owns everyone in it, one way or another." Who, Elsie asked, though she already knew the answer. Blackwood. The doctor flinched at the name. He wouldn't say more, just shook his head, muttering about his failing memory and the pressures of his work. He ushered her out of his office, his hands trembling violently. Elsie walked away, her mind reeling. Dr. Webb hadn't confirmed her suspicions, but his terror had. He knew something. He had been silenced. The fall wasn't an accident. It was an attack, a deliberate, calculated act of violence against a 10-year-old child. The first move in Blackwood's long, patient game of revenge. She found Jed on the edge of town where he'd been waiting. She told him about the doctor, her voice hoarse with a mixture of grief and rage. The realization that her entire life had been shaped by Blackwood's malice, that the pain she carried every day was a gift from him, was a staggering weight. Jed listened, his expression hardening into granite. "He's not just trying to take your land anymore," he said, his voice grim. "He's trying to erase you, just like he tried to all those years ago. We can't wait for him to make the next move. We have to force his hand." The sky was beginning to darken, not with the gentle hues of sunset, but with a bruised, yellowish-gray stain spreading from the west. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an oppressive energy. A storm was coming. Not a storm of rain, which this thirsty land so desperately needed, but a storm of wind and sand. As if on cue, the wind picked up a low moan that rustled the dry leaves of the cottonwoods. Dust devils began to dance across the street. The townspeople scurried indoors, barring their windows and doors. The coming storm was a tangible thing, a force of nature that promised to scour the world clean. It felt like an omen. Blackwood's threats, the town's hostility, the dark secrets of the past, it was all about to come to a head in a whirlwind of violence and truth. The sandstorm hit Redemption Creek like a physical blow. The sky turned a sickly, churning brown as a wall of sand and dust engulfed the town. The wind shrieked a high demonic keen that tore at shingles and rattled window panes. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world was reduced to a suffocating, abrasive chaos. It was the perfect cover for a man like Silas Blackwood to make his final move. A boy no older than 12 braved the storm to deliver a summons to Elsie's cabin. It was an official notice from the land office, a formal challenge to her deed. A hearing was to be held immediately to settle the claim. It was a transparently illegal maneuver, using the cover of the storm to ensure no one could interfere. "It's a trap," Jed said, his voice a low growl against the howl of the wind. "He means to finish this tonight." "I have to go," Elsie replied, her jaw set. "If I don't answer the summons, I forfeit the claim by default." "Then we go together." They rode into the maelstrom, bandanas tied over their faces to keep from breathing in the choking dust. The town was a ghost town, empty streets swept by ferocious gusts. The only light came from the land office, its windows glowing like malevolent eyes in the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of oil lamps. A fine grit covered every surface. Silas Blackwood stood behind his desk, looking as immaculate as ever, a stark contrast to the chaos raging outside. Sheriff Boone stood near the door, his face grim, his hand resting uneasily on the butt of his pistol. A third man, a nervous-looking clerk from a neighboring county, sat at a small table, a stack of papers in front of him. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, each tick a hammer blow marking the seconds until Elsie's world would be decided. Miss Miller, Blackwood said with a triumphant smile. "Thank you for coming. We can now resolve this unfortunate business." He produced a document with a flourish, a deed he claimed signed by his father and hers, granting the Blackwood family first right of purchase for a ludicrously small sum. A prior claim, you see, legally binding. "It's a forgery," Elsie stated, her voice ringing with conviction. "Prove it," Blackwood countered smoothly. "The clerk is here to verify the signatures and file the transfer of title. The law is on my side." The clock ticked on. The wind howled. It was her word against his, and in this town, his word was law. "You won't get away with this," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Blackwood laughed, a cold, empty sound. "My dear, I already have." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just like I got away with everything else. You know your horse was a beautiful animal. It was a shame to have to put a pebble under its saddle. A tiny, sharp pebble perfectly placed. It doesn't take much to turn a docile creature into a panicked beast. A little pain, a little fear, and a lifetime of consequences." The confession so casually delivered sucked the air from Elsie's lungs. It was real. The fall, the pain, the shame, it was all his doing. A cold, clarifying fury washed over her, burning away every last trace of fear. It was then that the office door burst open. Jed Stone stepped inside the storm, swirling in behind him. He was a specter of desert justice, his duster whipping around him, his pale eyes burning with a cold fire. "The hearing is over, Blackwood," Jed said, his voice calm but lethal. Blackwood's men, who had been waiting in the back room, emerged, their guns drawn. But Jed was not looking at them. His gaze was locked on the sheriff. "Boone," Jed said, "you were a deputy when it happened. You were the first one on the scene. You wrote the report that called it an accident." Sheriff Boone flinched as if struck. His face, already pale, turned ghostly white. The pieces clicked into place for Elsie. Boone hadn't just been negligent, he had been complicit. "He had my family," Jed the sheriff choked out, his voice thick with shame. "He threatened them. I had no choice." "There's always a choice," Jed said, his voice flat. Blackwood sneered. "Indeed. And you, Sheriff, have already made yours. Stand with me, or your wife and children will pay the price for your sudden bout of conscience." The standoff was absolute. The ticking clock, the screaming wind, the guns held in trembling hands. It was a crucible, and Sheriff Boone was at its white-hot center. His entire life, his honor, his redemption. It all came down to this single moment. Elsie looked at the sheriff, not with accusation, but with a plea in her eyes. She saw the years of self-loathing etched on his face, the torment of a man forced to live with his own cowardice. The clock on the wall began to chime the hour, the legal deadline. With a strangled cry of rage and regret, Sheriff Boone made his choice. He drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at Jed or Elsie. He swung it around and aimed it squarely at Silas Blackwood. "No more," Boone growled, his voice shaking but resolute. "It ends tonight." For the first time, Blackwood's composure shattered. His face contorted in a mask of fury. He lunged for his own gun, but it was too late. The office exploded with the deafening roar of a gunshot. The storm's fury seemed to pause, holding its breath in the aftermath of the gunshot. Silas Blackwood crumpled to the floor, a look of utter shock on his face. His reign of terror ended by the very man he had controlled for so long. His men, stunned by the sheriff's sudden betrayal, hesitated for a fatal second. Jed moved with the swift, deadly grace of a striking rattlesnake, disarming one man, while the other, seeing the tide had turned, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. The silence that followed was broken only by the mournful howl of the wind and the slow, steady ticking of the clock. Sheriff Boone stood over Blackwood's body, his pistol smoking his chest, heaving with ragged breaths. He looked at Elsie, his eyes filled with a terrible, profound sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said, the words a painful rasp. "For all of it." He laid his gun and his badge on the desk, a quiet act of surrender and penance. He had made his choice, and he was ready to accept the consequences. As the sandstorm began to subside, its rage spent the town of Redemption Creek, slowly emerged from the dust. The story of what happened in the land office traveled faster than the wind. When Jed and Elsie walked out into the clearing air, the faces that turned to them were different. The suspicion and scorn were gone, replaced by a mixture of awe, guilt, and a dawning respect. They saw not a broken woman and an outcast, but two people who had stood up to the tyrant, who had held them all in his thrall. Jed found the silver locket in Blackwood's coat pocket. He placed it gently into Elsie's trembling palm. She closed her hand around it, the cool metal a comforting weight. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a piece of her past stolen and now returned a symbol of everything she had fought for. The terrified clerk was now a willing witness, eager to testify about the forgery and Blackwood's confession. With the town's patriarch gone, other truths began to surface. Stories of blackmail, intimidation, and land grabs that had been whispered for years were now spoken aloud. The foundation of lies upon which Blackwood had built his empire crumbled into dust. In the days that followed, a federal marshal arrived to take Sheriff Boone into custody along with Blackwood's men. Boone went without protest, his head held high for the first time in years. He had lost his freedom, but he had reclaimed his soul. Redemption Creek, a town named in hope, but lived in fear, finally had a chance to live up to its name. With the immediate chaos settled, Elsie turned her attention to the final pieces of her father's life. Among his few possessions was a small locked metal box. Using a key she found hidden in his journal, she opened it. Inside, nestled beside the now official deed to her land, was a sealed letter addressed to her. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. The letter, written in her father's familiar hand, was not a will, but a confession and a plea for forgiveness. He laid bare his side of the story of his partnership with Blackwood's father. There had been no cheating, no grand betrayal. There had been a disastrous investment, a shared failure that the elder Blackwood, a proud and stubborn man, could not accept. He had blamed Thomas Miller for their ruin, poisoning his son Silas, with a tale of treachery that festered into a generational vendetta. Her father wrote of his deep regret over the broken friendship and the feud that followed. He also wrote of her mother, Eleanor. Silas Blackwood had loved her, it was true, but Eleanor had chosen Thomas. It was a rejection Silas could never forgive, twisting his grief into a venomous hatred for the man who had won her heart. He will never stop, Elsie. Her father had written, his hatred is all he has left. This land with its spring is your only defense. It is life. Hold on to it. Live. Be strong, not broken. The words blurred through her tears. The letter was a final precious gift, granting her the one thing she needed most, the full truth. It washed away the last lingering shadows of doubt and guilt, providing a complete emotional closure that no legal victory could offer. Her father was not the villain of Blackwood's story. He was just a man flawed and regretful who had loved his daughter. The next morning, she walked to the small windswept cemetery on the edge of town where her father was buried. The carved staff Jed had made for her was a familiar weight in her hand. She stood before the simple wooden cross, the desert wind tugging at her hair. She told him everything that had happened, her voice quiet but steady. She told him she understood. She took out the silver locket and placed it on the mound of earth for a moment, a final connection between the three of them, mother, father, and daughter. Then she picked it back up and clasped it around her neck. She was honoring her past, but she would no longer be defined by it. As she turned to leave, she leaned the carved staff against the grave marker. She walked away from the cemetery, her limp still present, a permanent part of her story. But it was no longer a source of shame. It was a scar, a testament to a battle she had fought and won. It was simply a part of her. Jed was waiting for her at the base of the hill. He watched her approach, his pale eyes taking in the new lightness in her step, the quiet strength in her posture. He didn't speak, but his gaze held a deep, abiding respect. She walked to him, her future unfolding before her, not as a solitary struggle, but as a shared journey. They stood together, two outcasts who had found solace not in their shared wounds, but in their mutual hard-won strength. Her land stretched out before them, promising not an easy life, but a life of their own, making a life where water and hope could finally spring forth from the dust.